Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. It is May of 2019. In this episode, I'm going to be expanding upon the supplemental information for the Satanic Panic Reconsidered series. In this one, we'll be taking a look at the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. In this particular episode, I will not be looking into the intelligence ties of the FMSF. We will not be taking a look at the CIA connections, the CIA funding that some of the advisory board members and founding board members have received over the years. Rather, in this episode, we're going to take a look at what their specific political interests are and why they would be involved in a foundation such as this. The False Memory Syndrome Foundation was founded in 1992, almost immediately in the wake of the final conclusion to the second trial for the McMartin preschool case. The intent of the organization has long been to undermine the credibility of child victim witnesses and adults who come to recall their childhood abuse. Two of the initial founders of the organization, Peter and Pamela Freed, were accused by their own daughter, Jennifer, who is now a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon, of having abused her when she was a child. And we can hear a little bit of the motivation from Jennifer Freed from her book published in 1996 called Betrayal Trauma. Now, this is found on the website of another victim named Barbara Rogers, whose website is called Screams from Childhood. She has an article that's called The War Against the Child's and Victim's Credibility and Truth. And she quotes Miss Freed here. If people who dare to speak about sexual abuse are attacked by those whom they have relied on and trusted, is it any wonder that unawareness and silence are so common? Survivors of childhood sexual abuse and betrayal trauma have learned to cope by being disconnected internally so as to manage a minimal kind of external connection. But with adult freedom and responsibility come the potential to break silence, to use voice and language to promote internal integration, deeper external connection, and social transformation. Through communication, integration within ourselves, and connection between individuals, we can become whole, embodied, aware, vital, powerful. Miss Freed's book actually covers the abuse suffered by Professor Ross Chait, author of The Witch Hunt Narrative. He was abused when he attended a summer camp at the San Francisco Boys Chorus. That case is too big for this particular episode, so I'm not going to cover that one here. Jennifer Freed has identified 7 factors that explain the isolation and abandonment of the victim who cannot share their traumatic experience with anyone. According to betrayal trauma theory, the 7 factors predicting amnesia are most likely to occur in incestuous abuse than in any other sort of abuse. The factors are abuse by a caregiver, explicit threats demanding silence, alternative realities in the environment, isolation during the abuse, a young age at the time of abuse, alternative reality defining statements by the caregiver, lack of discussion of abuse. Here I continue with Ms. Rogers' article as she says, her parents' actions against their adult daughter are most revealing and show drastically how agonizing her childhood was. Her parents founded the destructive and deeply false and deceptive False Memory Syndrome Foundation, which claims not only to represent scientific proof for a condition that is not recognized, and by not recognized here she means that is by the psychiatric manual called the DSM, or Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is used for the identification and diagnosis of illnesses, and of course for insurance purposes. I have 2 episodes that I did on the history of the construction of the DSM itself, and I'll link those below if you're interested in that. Continuing, but also that there is an epidemic of false memory syndrome. So this is one of the things that the witch hunt narrative hinges upon, you see, is they claim that there's this hysteria, they claim that people all across the country basically lost their minds, and some of them falsely claimed that there were hundreds or thousands of cases where people were falsely accused in daycare centers and babysitting services and all of this. And it all relates back to the Satanic Panic period. But of course here, as you dig deeper into this, you see what their actual motives are, what it is that they're covering up for, and you find out that there's lots of factual problems with their claims. And of course here I am not saying that all of the claims made related to SRA or satanic ritual abuse are true de facto or anything like that. because I do recognize that false accusations are horrendously damaging to all kinds of people's lives and they should not take place. But also the attacks on the credibility of children should not take place in this way either, and also not upon adults who remember abuse that they went through as a child and have forgotten that or buried it for whatever reason. Moving down a bit more in this article here, it continues, the Frades used their misleading, bogus foundation not only to attack their daughter's credibility and integrity, but also to support many other parents in court to fight their adult children's memories. In a terrible way, the freed parents turned the clock back for the victims of sexual abuse as they made it possible that therapists were taken to court and poured a lot of money into these trials. And of course, they hired a whole lot of these people were basically hired guns, like Elizabeth Loftus and Ralph Underwager. You'll find out more about him later. I'm going to show you something from this case called Mr. Bubbles that was in Australia that is highly revelatory of Mr. Underwager's credibility, shall we say. And they also tried to use him in the McMartin trial, but he was, basically kept out by the judge as a non-credible witness who couldn't be brought in. So they brought in yet another different hired gun who ran around doing the same kinds of things at dozens and dozens of other cases. Underwager, I think, went to several hundred cases. I'm pretty sure Loftus has done so as well. But the people who have crafted together the witch hunt narrative, or the Satanic Panic mythos as I prefer to refer to it, you'll see their names come up over and over again, and they all have sort of this circle where they all self-reference one another. So you'll see the journalists, they'll refer to Underwager, they'll refer to Loftus, they'll refer to the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, and then in vice versa, when you start reading their publications and the publications of other academics, you'll see them citing the same journalists, the same foundations, and all this sort of stuff. So this article continues by Ms. Rogers here. They also provided most irresponsibly dangerous and fake experts like Ralph Underwager. He was one of the FMSF founding members and at one time in great demand as an expert in court. He resigned from the FMSF board while his wife stayed on after he damaged his credibility in an Amsterdam journal for pedophiles. That would be the Pideka interview, and I'll get to that in a moment. When he supported pedophilia and claimed that it was, quote, God's will for adults to engage in sex with children. It is shocking how far this fraud foundation, with such miserable credibility and credentials, could get in influencing public opinion and convincing so many that there exists a false memory syndrome, even of epidemic proportions. And see, this is so key to the Satanic Panic mythos, the witch hunt narrative, is that they claim that there was a hysteria. They claim it was like the Salem witch trials, and there were these fake hunts all over the place that caught up people like Frank Fuster. That he's oh so innocent. The guy had committed first-degree manslaughter. He had molested another girl, then went on to molest lots and lots of children in the Country Walk case, which I have an episode on that, and I'll link that below. But they've even ran to the defense of a character such as he. And the article continues, it is sexual and physical abuse of children that exists in epidemic proportions, and that society ignores, silences, and does not care or attempt to address truthfully. And this is why stuff like Epstein will sort of pop up on the screen and then it just magically fades away again. Or you have a Jimmy Savile or a Jerry Sandusky abusing people for decades upon decades into the numbers of hundreds of abuse victims. And everybody acts like nobody ever knew anything. No, we have no idea. He's, just this wonderful guy. We have no idea how any of this happened. Jennifer Frade has written about the False Memory Syndrome Foundation the following, quote, from its inception, the False Memory Foundation has made media influence a priority, funneling public perceptions of the research through a specific value-laden filter. Yet there is no research to date documenting either a set of symptoms making up such a syndrome or an epidemic of these symptoms, in spite of the widespread promulgation of this term for political uses. We need to ask the following. Do false denials happen? If one is going to name syndromes, one also needs to ask about a false denial syndrome, which work with abusers suggests. So I'm going to transition from that to another article written by Lana Lawrence called False Memory Syndrome Foundation Asks Underwager and Wakefield, that would be his wife, Hollida Wakefield, to resign from advisory board, then changes position. It begins here, quote, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation's executive director, Pamela Frade, told Moving Forward that widely known psychologists and expert witnesses Ralph Underwager, Ph.D., and Holiday Wakefield, M.A., were asked to resign from the Foundation's advisory board on July 1. This action was taken as a result of questions raised over a 1991 interview that Underwager and Wakefield gave to the Netherlands publication Paideia, the Journal of Pedophilia, Winter 1993. And essentially, Paideia it's kind of an equivalent of NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association, which promotes so-called intergenerational love. Actually, it's pederasty and pedophilia. But the following day, Freud changed her position and said that the Foundation had not made a formal request for Underwager and Wakefield's resignations. Now, ultimately, Underwager did resign, but let's take a look at what it was Mr. Underwager had to say. So it begins here. He says, pedophiles can boldly and courageously affirm what they choose. They can say that what they want is to find the best way to love. Paideia interviewer, is choosing pedophilia for you a responsible choice for the individuals? Ralph Underwager response, and this is all quotation. Certainly it is responsible. What I've been struck by, as I have come to know more about and understand people who choose pedophilia, is that they let themselves be too much defined by other people. That is usually an essentially negative definition. Pedophiles spend a lot of time and energy defending their choice. I don't think that a pedophile needs to do that. Pedophiles can boldly and courageously affirm what they choose. They can say that what they want is to find the best way to love. I am also a theologian, and as a theologian, I believe it is God's will that there be closeness and intimacy, unity of the flesh between people. A pedophile can say, this closeness is possible for me within the choices that I've made. What about the child's choices? Interesting how that's left out. Pedophiles are too defensive. They go around saying, you people out there are saying that what I choose is bad, that it's no good. You're putting me in a prison. You're doing all these terrible things to me. I have to define my love as being in some way or other illicit. What I think is that pedophiles can make the assertion that the pursuit of intimacy and love is what they choose. With boldness, they can say, I believe this is in fact part of God's will. They have the right to make these statements for themselves as personal choices. Now, whether or not they can persuade other people that they are right is another matter, and he laughs. So here he is saying it's part of God's will that they abuse children and engage in pedophilia and pederastic rape, molestation, and child abuse. That, my friends, is the False Memory Syndrome Foundation and people who it sends around and has sent around for many, many decades as hired guns to all these different cases to be experts. And we'll go ahead and take a look here at Mr. Underwager's performance in the Mr. Bubbles case in Australia.
That a number of people, including some in high places, wanted to keep secret. The case against Mr. Bubbles. In that report, parents named Tony Derrin as the man who had sexually assaulted their children. Derrin's wife ran the kindergarten they attended. Tonight we investigate another crucial aspect of this disturbing case. You'll remember police listed 17 young victims, and more than 50 criminal charges were eventually laid. But when the Mr. Bubbles case went to court, not one of the children was called to give evidence. The charges were thrown out, and Tony Derrin was set free. One of the key Derrin witnesses was a hired gun from the United States, a psychologist named Ralph Underwager, who says he's an expert in child sexual abuse. He testified that the children's evidence had been contaminated and that they were too young to know what the truth was. But just what is Mr. Underwager's expertise? And how much respect does he command in American courts? We went there to find out. And we should warn that at times in this report, the language has to be quite explicit.
You're a bastard.
No, I'm not.
You're a bastard.
This is Ralph Underwager, psychologist. He was paid $25,000 and gave crucial evidence in favour of Tony Derrin. Evidence which helped Derrin walk free.
Your people can leave now. You go out the door now.
When we wanted to question Mr. Underwager about his involvement in the Bubbles case, the questions got too harsh.
You go out the door now.
But first, a reminder of the case against Mr. Bubbles.
Jocelyn said that they got undressed and that they got into a bathtub that was full of bubbles and that they played in the bathtub.
Did Mr. Bubbles ever get in the bath himself?
Yes, he did.
With
She said that he got in without any clothes on. They'd get undressed and get in the bath while he had a shower. He had a shower before he hopped in the bath with them.
Mr. Bubbles?
Yes.
Always the same story. 3- and 4-year-olds being lured into bubble baths with a man who sexually abused them.
Having examined them and talked with them, our unit's convinced that those children were sexually abused.
Absolutely no doubt.
No doubt at all.
That's the evidence Professor Kim Oates wanted to give in court, but he was never asked. As head of the Child Protection Unit at the Camperdown Children's Hospital in Sydney, he's known around the world as an expert in detecting child sexual abuse. So we have 18 children who were examined, 5 of whom your staff say were definitely sexually abused, and all of them from the same preschool. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think if you look at the incidence of significant child sexual abuse in the community, significant enough to leave physical findings in the preschool age group, I think it's extraordinary.
This is Jocelyn's medical report from the Children's Hospital, and it's very clear. There had been trauma specifically directed at the genitalia.
You can't let people walk around scot-free abusing children.
As the word spread, more and more children were taken to the local police station after initial questioning by their distraught parents. Questions which brought bizarre answers and led police here. The kindergarten the children attended, Sea Beach Kindergarten. The children told parents and police how they were taken from here for parties, special parties, hosted by Mr. Bubbles.
Do you know Mr. Bubbles?
Yes.
This reenactment is from the official police transcript.
Did Mr. Bubbles touch you between your legs?
On my toes.
Yes, did he touch your toes?
Mr. Bubbles not in to touch my toes.
This is Debbie's medical report. Once again, it was positive. There was sexual abuse.
I put some things in his body and he put some things in my body, but I didn't want him to.
Cindy's medical report confirms she was abused. The doctor found signs consistent with traumatic dilatation of the anus.
What does Mr. Bubbles look like?
Big black hair everywhere.
Have you ever had a sore fanny, Elaine?
Yes.
Why was it sore?
Mr. Bubbles did it.
As her mother, what was your reaction to all of this?
Kill him. If I could get hold of him. I mean, I just hope he rots in hell. I really do.
Elaine's medical report. Again, positive. Vaginal penetration.
I mean, it's just devastating. Absolutely devastating.
So who is Mr. Bubbles? If you ask the children of the parents we spoke with, you get the same answer.
I held her in the lineup at Monavale Police Station, and she identified the man out of the 7 people in that lineup as Mr. Bubbles.
Joe, can I just show you a photograph? Is that the man that Jocelyn identified?
Yes, it is. It's Mr. Bubbles.
And it's also
Anthony Derrin.
The police constable showed the photos again and she said, yes, there's the bubble man to that particular...
This is Baroko Courthouse, Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. In 1972, Derrin was brought here, charged with the aggravated assault of 2 young girls. He'd interfered with them in a swimming pool, something Derrin admits, and both charges were proven.
And I must say it's a scar in my life. Probably let's say the first of my life.
Tony Derrin made this confession on the Hinge program.
Well, actually, there were two girls between the ages of 10 and 13. Just had in the swimming pool, playing games with the children, and I seem to have this need to touch young girls on a private part.
After the break, we'll return with the case against Ralph Underwager, the man who helped set Tony Derren free. There's no doubt scores of questions remain unanswered in the Mr. Bubbles case, and some of them relate to Ralph Underwager, the expert witness Tony Derren paid to testify on his behalf. Ralph Underwager was imperative to Tony Derren's defence. As a supposed independent expert, he testified that the evidence of the Bubbles children had become contaminated, and they were too young to understand their duty to tell the truth. But here in America, we've certainly discovered Underwager's reputation and credentials aren't all they're cracked up to be. Mr. Peters, are professional witnesses like Ralph Underwager dangerous?
They can be very dangerous when they...
Jim Peters is a senior attorney with the National Centre for the Prosecution of Child Abuse. He's investigated Underwager for the past 3 years.
Underwager is presented as a scientific observer, when in fact, from our perspective, more often than not, he's there as an advocate.
And anything but independent.
Anything but.
Well, he is someone who makes his living going around the country and testifying against children in child sexual abuse cases. He says the same thing in essentially every case, which is every...
And Anna Salter knows what she's talking about. A PhD from Harvard and a master's degree in early childhood. She says young children can be believed.
I mean, this is consistent with the literature. If you look at what is the best legal textbook in the country today on children as witnesses, Child Witness Theory and Practice, John Meyer says clearly children as young as 3 can comprehend the duty to tell the truth.
And this man is a highly respected legal scholar in America.
I think he's fairly clearly the chief leading scholar on child sexual abuse in the country.
6 American states have given Dr. Salter a grant to check Underwager's methods in court. And what did she find?
That he isn't accurate. That what he says in court does not necessarily fairly represent the literature.
He distorts the facts?
Frequently. Sometimes he quotes specific studies, and he's frequently wrong about what the studies say.
So we thought we'd get Dr. Salter to analyse the evidence Underwager gave under oath at the Mr. Bubbles hearing, where he testified his qualifications had never been questioned. But in an American case, the Swan case, this is what the court said about Ralph Underwager.
The court remains convinced the psychologist did not have the qualifications to testify as a doctor. The trial court ruled that the psychologist's proposed testimony was not proper because there was no indication that the results of the doctor's work had been accepted in the scientific community.
In the Mr. Bubbles case, he said his qualifications were never in question.
Well, if he's talking about the Swan ruling, you could say he was perseverating.
Lying.
Yes.
Now, the second incident in the Mr. Bubbles case was where Underwager said that 90% of accusations against child molesters are wrong. Now, is that backed up scientifically?
No, that's gobbledygook. I don't know of any study that would support that.
We arranged to meet him here to talk about his involvement in the Mr. Bubbles case. And, right on cue, Underwager presents his evidence.
There is a major German study that was done and reported in 1983, and a major finding is that for children who have been abused, the impact of adult behaviors toward actually abused children is more traumatic and does more harm to the children than the abuse itself.
Is that right?
Yes.
What report's this?
It's Bauermann, 1983. In German, it's Sexualität, Gewalt und psychische Folgung.
And what did Bauermann really say?
Well, I'm afraid what it said was, of the reported sexual contacts, half of the sexual victims claimed that the sexual act itself to be the main cause of injury, 1/3 the behavior of the suspect, and 1/10 each the behavior of relatives, friends, or the police. In other words, instead of saying that the majority of children were harmed by the system, they said that it was a very small minority.
Mr. Underwager, I have the Bauermann report in front of me.
Yes, sir.
It's directly opposite to what you just said.
No, I don't believe it is at all. I'm saying, I didn't say that that's what happens in every case.
No, but you said the majority of cases.
No, I don't believe I did.
Over the past couple of years, courts across America have begun saying no to Underwager, that his expert evidence is unreliable. 2 recent cases here in New York said just that. But even more damning was a case last year, the Herrick case.
It was the court's observation that Dr. Underwager's testimony was based on inadequate research, and his preparation was inadequate and therefore lacking in sound foundation.
Again, damning.
Yes, it is.
I mean, there's no bones about it there. Inadequate.
In all of these cases, that's what the courts have ruled.
So while Underwager was being rejected here in America, he had no such trouble at the Mr. Bubbles hearing in Australia, where he testified that the children were too young to tell the truth.
I don't believe that I testified to that at all. And if you'd have to produce something from the transcript. That's not what I testified to. What I testified to is, I believe, basically that up to about age 6 or 7, the psychological research suggests or shows that the concept children have of truth is going to be one primarily of what keeps me out of trouble.
Well, I do happen to have a part of the transcript.
Fine.
Let me read it to you. This is what you said in court. Children up to age 10 or 11 simply do not have the capacity to think abstractly.
Right.
And to consider what's true.
Yes.
So in effect, you're saying that these children, in the Bubbles case, age 3 and 4, were too young to understand the truth.
No, not at all. What you are doing is distorting and twisting the language that a psychologist would use.
In relation to the Bubbles hearing, there were statements from the children saying, which I'm sure you read, what happened to them. There was positive ID of Tony Derrin as Mr. Bubbles by a number of children, plus the fact that at least 5 of the children, and all girls, were positively physically abused. Were you aware of the medical evidence at the time?
I have not reviewed the file that I had at that time.
But were you aware that there was evidence?
I'm going to stop this. We're done. I don't believe that you are being fair. And I don't believe that your approach is an impartial and objective one.
Why is that?
Because of the way that you're coming across. I mean, we're done, and I am not going to give you permission to use anything that you have taped up to this point.
You're getting a little defensive, aren't you, Mr. Underwager?
Oh, I'm getting pissed.
Do you think Underwager has got a lot to answer for over the years?
I think so. I think a lot of children have suffered at his hand. That children who probably have been abused have been put back into situations where they're likely to have been molested again.
I think that Underwager must have trouble sleeping.
Why don't you sit down and talk about all your facts, all this research that you quote?
You are to leave my home.
Mr. Underwager, you have researched...
You are to leave my home.
And quoted research inaccurately and distorted it for years.
I am not willing to continue. You're a bastard.
No, I'm not.
You're a bastard.
I just love children.
And you're a bastard. To come here under false pretenses.
Not at all. Some say that you go to court under false pretenses, Mr. Underwager.
You leave my home. Your people can leave now. You go out the door now.
Questions getting a bit hard, were they?
You go out the door now.
I would like to ask you about your qualifications. In the Mr. Bubbles case, you said that your qualifications had never been questioned in relation to the Swan case.
You go out the door now.
You told an untruth in the Mr. Bubbles hearing.
You go out the door now.
You don't want to answer that?
I'm telling you to go out the door now, or I'm calling the police.
I think you've shown your true colours. We should leave. Thank you, Mr. Underwager. Appreciate your time. Jeff, we don't want to continue the interview?
I'm 61 years old Saturday. And I think you are one of the most dishonorable men that I have ever met.
That's what a lot of clinical psychologists say about you. You should be aware of that.
I am fully aware of that.
Ralph Underwager has testified for the defendants in about 400 child abuse cases. We wanted to question him about his performance in some of those and about other matters too. But, as you've seen, he didn't give us the chance.
And this really only represents sort of the tip of the iceberg for the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, which the advisory board is actually separate from the board or its board of directors. And that's typically where you find all of the intel assets, all of the connections to the CIA and other intel agencies, so on and so forth. But they also have interesting associations with some in the official capital S Skeptic Society, such as James Randi, who himself has had some interesting run-ins, shall we say, with accusations surrounding matters similar to what the FMSF deals with. However, that is beyond the scope of this particular episode. And now I'm going to wrap up this episode by covering a short article published in March of 2000 titled New Research Casts Doubts on False Memory Syndrome by Patricia Rainey, published by Reuters, London. Quote, British scientists say they have cast doubts on the prevalence of false memory syndrome and the idea that recovered memories are often bogus ones induced by therapists. The theory that memories of events which never occurred can be constructed by suggestion during therapy has been used successfully as a defense by those accused of child abuse to discredit children's testimony. Researchers at University College London claim their study of data from 236 adults with recovered memories shows many are of true past events. There is now consistent evidence that false memory syndrome cannot explain all or even most examples of recovered memories of trauma, the British Psychological Society said in a statement. There is increasing evidence that many recovered memories cannot be explained by so-called false memory syndrome. To date, there is no convincing evidence for a specific false memory syndrome, Dr. Bernice Andrews, who conducted the study, told Reuters. What we've shown is that a substantial proportion of these memories have been corroborated, she said in a telephone interview. Hopefully one day we'll be able to put an end to people referencing the False Memory Syndrome Foundation as a credible piece of evidence related to anything related to the witch hunt narrative or the Satanic Panic mythos. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.